shift to invisible disabilities. So things like ADHD and mental health disabilities. So invisible disabilities are just disabilities that a professor, if they were looking, wouldn't be able to discern, right? They wouldn't be able to tell from any outward sign. And so that makes it a challenge too, because profs can't see the disability. So that makes it challenging. So, and they have no training in things like what an invisible disability is, what a mental health disability is, and why that would require more time on a test.
Welcome to the Braemar Life Skills Academy podcast, where we'll explore the evolving world of education and student well-being. I'm your host, Mike Helsby, and in Season 2, we're focused on personal well-being, self-regulation, and innovative learning strategies for school and everyday life. Whether you're an educator, parent, student, or education thinker, this podcast is for you. Join us for insightful discussions, valuable perspectives, and a fresh look at the future of learning. Let's take that step into the future of education together. Welcome back to the Braemar Life Skills Academy podcast. I'm your host, Mike Helsby, and I am really excited today to be joined by Jenny Sampirisi. Jenny is a multifaceted education professional with a 2-decade career serving as a learning and inclusion education developer at Toronto Metropolitan University. A recognized poet for her innovative style blending poetry and prose, she explores internal identity complexities within limiting environments. Specializing in first-year courses, Sampirisi identified systemic exclusivity as a major barrier in higher education, driving her to support the creation, development, and implementation of access to education programs. Her pivotal role in Toronto Metropolitan University's Spanning the Gaps program earned her the Dean's Teaching Award in 2011, and currently she focuses on training faculty to see barriers within the education system as movable and providing them with practical tools to make higher education more accessible for students with disabilities. Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So as always, we want to give our listeners as much context and grounding here as possible. So please just feel free to take over the space. Tell us about yourself, your journey, perhaps beginning as a student through our education systems, your work as a writer, and then especially into your work with the Spanning the Gaps program and at TMU currently.
The whole life story.
Sure. Yeah, no big deal.
I started out going to the University of Windsor for creative writing. I was the first in my family to go to university, and it was very uncommon for anyone to even think about university in my family. And we're talking generations and generations. It just wasn't a thought people had. You went into the trades for the most part in my family. And so me wanting to go to university, one, was weird, and then wanting to go for creative writing was double weird. And so I decided to go on this journey. It was like my dream. I wanted to be a writer. So I went to university. And this program at the University of Windsor was a very competitive one. You had to compete to get into every class, not just into the program itself. Every single semester you'd have to compete to get in. And through portfolio entrance and things like that. So it was a really intense experience of undergrad. Also showing up, I just sort of felt like a fish out of water. Like everybody around me knew what was going on. Like they had this grounded understanding in how this whole institution functioned, and I had no idea. Words like syllabus would get used, and I'd be like, what the heck's the syllabus? Nobody ever sat me down and explained that. And it just felt like I was constantly grasping to figure out what I was supposed to be doing, how I was supposed to be doing it, and to perform. And then to kind of mix that together with something that I loved so much, which was creative writing, and the very stereotypical daydream of becoming a writer one day and publishing books was really what I was there for. And to have that competing with this environment that was so performative and so many expectations,
Mm-hmm.
and you're trying to get A's and you're trying to prove that you belong there, and all of those pieces were really tough to reconcile. And I just ended up really working very, very hard and doing everything in my power to succeed, which meant performing in the best way possible in that context of that university. And I don't think it was until many, many years, and I'm talking about all this because it wasn't until many years later when I started teaching that I realized that that was a very common feeling that I had. I thought I was alone. And then I started working in Spanning the Gaps, which is a program for students who wouldn't otherwise interact with post-secondary. So for whatever reason, they either dropped out of high school, they didn't get their high school diploma, or they didn't have the grades, or life stuff happened along the way, whatever it is. They wouldn't typically interact with post-secondary. And this is a bridging program to give them a number of courses. If they get a C or higher in those courses, they get an automatic acceptance into the university.
Mm.
And so I was supporting that program by creating curriculum. And then the first time I taught in it, which was the pilot year, I realized, oh my gosh, they all are having these exact same feeling I was having. And I'm at the front of the room and I have all this power to like get rid of that. So like I can speak to that part of them that's freaking out right now, going, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. And so I started in a way kind of talking to myself, that first year student sitting in that lecture hall with all those hundreds of students around me, thinking I'm really dumb and I just like, they're going to figure that out and I don't belong here. And so I started to like just like pause, like, okay, we can talk about English literature in a minute, but first let's talk about how it feels to get a syllabus for the first time. What's going on? How does that sit with you? What questions do you have? Because it's okay to have those questions. And they started talking and they started revealing that they were feeling those same things. And then we started talking a lot about that in the class. Um, yeah, so that's kind of my trajectory between how I felt as a student to how I teach now. And I think in my years in Spanning the Gaps, I learned a lot from students about like much more complex. I stopped teaching to myself and that earlier version of myself, because they had much more complex experiences. They had very different things that they were carrying with them. And I started to learn a lot more from them about what it's like to be in an institution that makes you feel like you don't belong in it, whether that's coming from a feeling of, you know, your previous education, or if it's coming from trauma, or if it's coming from racial coding and all kinds of things. They were experiencing all of that. And so learning from them how to make them feel welcome in the environment or give them space to feel unwelcome that was being acknowledged was a long and really powerful learning experience for me. And then I've since moved into the disability support office, where I train faculty in how to create much more inclusive educational environments for students, specifically students with disabilities, but that it's broader than that. We have a lot of really good conversations about inclusive educational environments. So
Mm.
yeah, that's kind of like the scope.
Yeah. Thanks for, I know it's not always easy to can a life's worth of experience. It's a 5-minute bio, but you've done very, very well there. Thank you. There are a ton of entry points that I'm tempted to take there, and we are going to spend a lot of time today, especially talking to the educators and the parents out there about the challenges that young people are facing today, the barriers to entry for something like a post-secondary education and the life that comes after it, and the important work that you've done with Spanning the Gaps, and maybe even some of the dynamics with training educators and the successes and challenges of changing the way that people approach their students, and perhaps changing decades worth of practice in some cases. But you are also in a really unique and special position to talk to the young people, our young listeners out there, who I think probably recognized a lot of themselves in your description there. The phrase that comes readily to mind, though it may not be completely accurate and has some problematics associated with it, is imposter syndrome. This really felt sense, and I think we're starting to see an almost universally felt sense that for one reason or another, I, the learner, I, the worker, do not belong in this setting, that everybody else gets it, gets something, understands the definition of syllabus, or knows what's expected of them in terms of the formats and the structures of expression that are acceptable in a certain setting. They know the logistics of their workplace, and I'm alone. I'm isolated in my unknowing, and in my lack of preparation. And such is our culture that feeling does not immediately lead to a reaching out, in most cases, to a connection with those who may know better or may be able to help, but rather a retreating in, and a sort of, the phrase is used often enough, faking it till you make it, right? Or fake it till you make it. And that is for those of us who've experienced it, an ugly, lonely, anxiety-ridden feeling. And so you've beautifully come full circle from that feeling as a student to being in a professional position to intervene and help those who may be left feeling that otherwise. Can we jump all the way back? You're entering the University of Windsor, going into their creative writing program. I know you finished with an MA in creative writing and moved into a really impressive writing career of your own. Especially these creative subjects, which is kind of a weird way to categorize expression, but we do divide it into these creative subjects. They seem ill at ease in our university system, which is so intent on quantification and on standardization and providing grades. So in the case of creative writing, we're literally grading people for what's meant to be something, we hope, very personal, very authentic, something that comes from deep inside them. Talk to us about that lived experience of bringing your creative self into this very standardized setting, and what did it look like trying to move and shake in that setting, trying to be you and be authentic in a place that seems to be trying to turn you into everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like, it is a place that's trying to turn you into everybody else. And that sounds very cynical, but in order to do that quantitative thing, in order to measure what is quality, what is good, what is an A versus a B, there has to be some kind of standard for that. And so in a creative writing program, what's the difference between somebody's poem and another person's poem? One gets an A and one gets a C. So there had to be a criteria for that. So there was a feeling of having to conform in a way, but I don't want to say that cynically, because it was kind of like if you're learning music, you got to learn the scales first and then you can start doing free jazz later. And so
Right.
I was learning the scales in university, and I was getting a lot of, and the skills that I learned and the way that I learned them were according to the criteria that would get you the A. And that's such an interesting thing. And even though it's a creative profession that we're talking about, a creative subject, it's true for, like, I see it with my students now. I see it with students that I work with um, as a learning strategist. They're working toward that A, and that's the criteria that they're trying to meet. And so that it is a performance. It's always a performance of what will get you the biggest gold star, the one that you were all searching for, which is the A or the high GPA or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so being in that environment where I was always just trying to perform to get the A, and learning creative writing, which was about taking one's voice and putting it in the most vulnerable place possible, a public venue where people could then pick it apart and tell you that it wasn't reaching that gold star, it wasn't getting the A. And you would go back and revise it and bring it back again and hope that this time it got what it was supposed to get. It was a very hard process, one that I excelled at because I learned how to perform in that system, and it was like a survival mechanism to perform in that system. So yeah, I learned it, but there's something about it that is really tough. I think not just for students in creative fields, but in any field where you're constantly doing through a trial and error process, trying to figure out what they want from you. And it's
Mm-hmm.
hard because the errors often get you bad grades, so they're penalized. And so there's not a lot of room for trial and error.
Yeah. You've emphasized the word perform a number of times talking about this. Performance is a sort of paradoxical idea. There's something inherent within performance, and I'm imagining performances of all kinds, but especially the artistic and perhaps the dramatic comes most readily to mind. Um, that gives us space and scope to express some things about ourselves and some things about life that are really tough to do in regular conversation, in everyday life. But performance, almost by definition, is also something that happens externally to you. I'm thinking of the concept of breaking the fourth wall, where for within theater for a moment, especially in some postmodern works, you can, I guess, quote unquote, become a person with the audience again, or admit that I am an actor speaking lines and not spontaneously being authentic with you or whole with you. So this paradox exists between the access that performance gives us to perhaps, like, again, access something really, really real, but also it moves us away from ourselves in a sense, or it takes us out of our authentic being. What happened to poetry for you in that setting where you were being asked to sort of jump through some hoops or find a way to meet standards and get those gold stars in the midst of doing this thing, which so clearly, I mean, you've got your published works, Croak and If Was. Anybody can happily go on the podcast notes and see your Wikipedia page and see some of the wonderful things you've done with literature since your MA. What was it like trying to retain the really, really real alongside the performance?
Yeah. Yeah. It's nerve-wracking and stressful, but and so I think about writing a lot through this theorist named Helen Sissou, and she talks about the three steps on the ladder of writing. And in it, she, like, in most theories of writing, it comes from this like otherworldly inspiration. Like you look up to the heavens and you get inspired, and then like that's kind of the long history of our relationship to anything inspiring, any kind of artistic endeavors. Usually it's coming from the heavens in
The
some way.
muses or something
She
like
writes
that. Yeah.
about it in this totally different way that I really love, which the three steps on the ladder of writing aren't ascending. They don't go up. You actually climb down into writing.
Mm.
And as you climb down, she has this image that I love of it, where it's you kind of go into this lake and you go down, down, down to the bottom of the lake where there's no light, and you grab a fistful of the silt and stuff that's in the bottom, and you go up to the surface and you open up your hand and see what kind of things you brought up from underneath. And she said that's what it's like. It's like spelunking into yourself and pulling up this gunk and then putting it out there and working with it in front of everybody, and hoping to some degree that that's universal, like that what you bring out, what you talk about, what you experience will connect with others on a more universal level than your own. So it's this weird, very personal thing that also gets attached to a very universal thing. So you're hoping others will also see themselves in the gunk you pulled up from yourself. And that's it feels quite dangerous in a way to do it, because when you're bringing up that stuff, you don't know if it will resonate, and you don't know if people want to look at it with you and things like that. So that was tough. But after I left university and was out on my own, and really it was like sink or swim. Now you're out here, there's no grades, there's nothing, you got to figure out what your voice is, and you have to see if you can make it. And what came up was a lot about that feeling of performance. So Croak is very much, it's an opera, and it's a frog and girl opera, and these frogs and these girls are trying to perform in a society where they have all these expectations on them, and they kind of fail at it. They fail to perform in the ways that they're expected to perform. And what comes out of it is kind of like a whole new creature called a frog girl that kind of morphs into it. I know it's very complicated, but that's what came out of me. And I think it was really a critique of trying to be the expectation of the society, of patriarchy, of all of these things, of maybe even a way of rejecting the idea of getting the gold star. I wanted to
Mhm.
write something that was a failure in a way that it itself performed failure. Yeah.
It's a wonderful metaphor, the spelunking inside the self, because you're right. We do often think of artistic expression as in the light or reaching something higher. And the best of it is often the thing that reminds us how lost we are together, in a sense, like how scary and powerful and exciting, but mostly also confusing and incomplete this life can be. Um, it reminded me very much of that famous line from Kafka that literature is the axe that hacks away at the ice of the soul. And take that one step further. Why is this stuff? Why is the stuff that comes up, that silt that you mentioned? Why is it down there buried in the dark? Why is it covered in ice? It has so much to do with bringing it back to that feeling of being in that first university class, that you're alone, that you're the only one not getting it, right? That you've been thrown here amongst a whole bunch of other folks who have their act together or who are living their fullness in the light while you're hiding in the shadows. Um, I love being able to have conversations like this in the presence of an audience with listeners, because I hope it's just one amongst a million other small steps that are being taken towards one another, and to reassure one another that for large portions of our life, we don't get it either. And
Yeah.
it's scary and confusing and incomplete. Um, Before we move into your work with TMU and your wonderful retraining of staff towards access and towards a different kind of seeing of their students, there's a lot of young people out there who have something to say, and sometimes it's buried in the muck, or sometimes it's frozen in the ice. For somebody who's successfully hacked away at some of that ice, or has gone spelunking a few times, do you have any words of wisdom or any starting points for those who may want to retain some sort of authentic expression in the midst of their pursuit through these various systems?
Yeah, I think if there's anything I learned throughout it, I had a writer friend who talked about the the spectral theater, which is like the ghost audience that lives in your head. And so whenever you are sitting down to write and you write, and this is true of academic writing, it's true of all kinds of writing, not just anything where you are doing something that is performed, that something that either is performed for class or performed um, in front of somebody that someone will judge in some way. Often this group of people shows up in your head who says that's not good, or that's not great, or you're not doing it right. You sure that's really what you want to say? There's all of these people, and they can be people that you want to impress as well as people that you're afraid will judge you really harshly. And that spectral audience that's sitting there listening as you are in the moment of creation, they need to be quiet sometimes. And so that's my advice, is to figure out who's in your audience, and to figure out when they need to be quiet for a bit.
Mm.
I had a professor once tell me that you can she went so far as to say you can tie up that internal editor, that group of people that's like naysaying at you. You can tie them up and put them in a corner if you like, and then you can untie them and bring them out whenever you like, which is a little bit more macabre. But it's basically saying that you do have to kind of have some control, take some control over how much that is impacting your ability to continue, because sometimes it can shut it down, sometimes it can take it in directions that you didn't want to go because you're just trying to please that internal audience.
Hmm.
Sometimes they need to be quiet, sometimes they can come back and give you some notes.
Uh, that resonates so strongly with me. I'm working with a few students right now doing some journaling practices, and using journaling as kind of a step towards what we might call clearing out some space, clearing out some headspace to maybe access something a bit more true and real. Because as a number of them have pointed out to me, and as you just alluded to, you can spend a whole life living up to the standards of those voices in your head. Those what journaling guru Campbell Walker calls the interlopers on your houseboat. Right? He's talking about clearing out your head as a houseboat. You got to clear out the houseboat if you're going to sail straight and true. And as you're clearing out the junk, you start to realize that there's a whole bunch of people who've gotten on board your boat and just never left. Right? And they're sitting there, and some of them are He talks about the teacher who criticized your handwriting when you were in grade 2, or the romantic partner when you were a teenager who said, "Let's just be friends," or the uncle who you told your career aspirations to, and he kind of chuckled, and for whatever reason, that chuckle lives deep in your soul and pops up every time you try to do something new and performative. We carry those voices with us, and fortunately, creative expression seems to be something like um, the practice that can quiet those voices and tune us back into something um, truer in us. Um, it's convenient to be talking in these ways about artistic expression because it feels to me like there's a ton of overlap between the vulnerability and the fear that goes into writing something or performing something, um, and the fear and the vulnerability that go into applying for post-secondary education or applying for that first job, taking a step of belief in yourself and trying to move forward into something new and scary and tough. For you, that, as you mentioned, that had a lot to do with coming from a family and a background that didn't talk or think a lot about university, that perhaps didn't raise university or college up as a really important goal in the way that it is raised up in some contexts. Um, to what extent are you seeing that echoed in the lives of the students you've been working with over your 2 decade career, and especially your work with TMU? And what are the other uh, common barriers to entry that prevent um, specific demographics from really taking a shot on themselves or feeling like university or college is a space where they might have success?
Yeah, I mean, there's two big questions there, so I'm trying
Mm,
to figure out which way to go there. But the students in my classes are often the first in their family to go to university at all. Um, and they're also coming in as adults for the most part. So they're mature students. And there's something about coming in, there's a beautiful thing that happens. Because I also teach first years who are not through Spanning the Gaps, who have just entered through the normal means of entry. Um, the students in Spanning the Gaps will call you out. They'll be like, "You just used a word I don't get. Why are you making me feel like this? I'm uncomfortable." And they will immediately call me on stuff. Or they'll be like, "Wait a minute, we just talked about this last day and we talking about this day. Are these things connected? Can you tell me about that?" And they get really excited and they're very vocal in a way that my first years sadly are not. They're very withdrawn. They're very much just like, just tell me what I need to do and I'll get out of here. And I don't know if that feeling is coming from being in the schooling system for so long that you've just sort of been in a way programmed to just sit and listen and kind of passively absorb information and then spit out what's expected, versus being, as I see with my Spanning the Gap students, where they're so engaged, they're so there, and they're so willing to call out something that doesn't make sense or something that's confusing. Also willing to behind the scenes pull me aside and say, "I'm having that feeling that you were talking about. Can you help me with it? Or what do I do about this?" So they are much better at help seeking. The things that might be barriers, though, the things that are just to me the most obvious barriers, is that it's not a very welcoming space. I don't think those of us who, you know, went through the system in the best way possible, who got all the A's, even if we felt that discomfort along the way, when we come out the other side with our PhDs or whatever else, I think we forget how alienating the system is when you first enter it. Like when you first enter, even just the process of applications, how it feels so labyrinthine and like
mhm.
bureaucratic, and the expectation that you would understand all of what is being asked of you, and like the cognitive load of doing that, like the amount your brain has to work to figure out this whole new landscape of language and ideas and bureaucracy, really, is not well explained. There's a lot more expectation on students to just figure it out, and this is often referred to as like the hidden curriculum.
Yeah.
And so that's like the stuff that nobody teaches you, but you're just expected to know. But a huge portion of your ability to succeed is in understanding what you're not taught and being able to do it. And so I work in disability, and I see students all the time who have a huge challenge just navigating, how do I get accommodations? I think I have a disability. How do I go through that? And it's a juggernaut. It's so much, it's so many steps, it's so much expectation, and they're all alone with it for the most part. So that's a good reason to kind of say never mind, right?
Yeah.
Or I can't, or I don't get it, or I don't think it's just imposter syndrome. I think it's that the actual institution doesn't understand that it's making it obtuse. It's making it hard for students to navigate within it. So of course they're going to feel isolated. Yeah.
I'm so pleased that you drew that dichotomy between the expressions of the students who are in that sort of first year and who've gone through that more traditional route into university, and those who are in your Spanning the Gaps program, because it illustrates, I think, a contradiction that's really at the heart of not just our post-secondary institutions, but our entire culture of education right now. In one sense, there is or at least there's at least the residue of a tradition in education that is primarily exclusionary. And exclusionary in the sense that it believes itself to be a meritocracy that is sort of filtering the majority of the young population into their adult positions in the world. And I think the underlying assumption is that it's doing so with some accuracy. And we know that there are, especially the big universities, the Ivy Leagues, the Russell Group schools, who pride themselves primarily or value themselves primarily on the number of students that they're able to reject, the number of applications they're able to reject each year. We know there's huge issues with massively increased application numbers without anywhere near proportionate raises in the number of seats available in a number of these schools. And a lot of the standardization, the quantification, the grading feeds into that sort of exclusionary ethos. On the other hand, I think especially in grassroots levels, and especially with younger educators, we're seeing an almost oppositional approach to education. That education is one of the best ways we have of alleviating generational poverty, perhaps even generational trauma. That this is a space that needs to be made equitable and accessible. This is a space that needs to be, or an institution or a system that is designed to identify barriers and identify disabilities or situations that require accommodation and be ready to provide those accommodations. And I'm sure you can speak perhaps better than anyone to this sense that when you speak to some educators, you get nothing but yeses about that stuff. They're excited to do it. They're ready to start engaging with students who are readily raising their hands in classroom, or maybe even just shouting out in classrooms, "I don't get that word. Can you draw this connection? You're making me feel this way." Right? There's a lot of educators who would say that's exactly the classroom that I want. There's a whole bunch of other educators who would say that's my nightmare. Right? I want the silent classroom. I want the students to feel as though they need to put every bit of themselves into just keeping up. Right, just catching up with all of this complex material because it is exclusive material, right? We're in rarefied air here. So that's a long way of setting the context for what you've been doing as a learning and inclusion education developer, working with the Spanning the Gaps program, and now working with educators themselves. Can you talk about what does that role look like on a day-to-day basis, both in terms of your interactions with the students? What are the typical cases that you're seeing, and perhaps some advice for educators in terms of successful approaches you've had with those young people? And talk to us also about the conversations you're having with educators. Where are the successes? Where's the resistance? Where's the hope? And where's the challenge?
Yeah. So my day-to-day work right now is I'm a learning and inclusion education developer. So education developers at universities typically live in their learning and teaching offices. And the idea, this is a very new thing that even exists, right? An education developer at a university. At some point, if you read up on the history of it, at some point, universities realized, oh, we've got a lot of people who know a lot about their subject and their discipline, but they don't necessarily know a lot about teaching. So who's setting the tone on campus for the pedagogy, like what's our pedagogy as an institution. And so that's where these learning and teaching offices started to come out of. They are there to offer training and support to the faculty, and usually have a kind of theory or ethos, right, of pedagogy. Where I am right now, so at TMU in academic accommodation support, they've created an education developer inside of the disability support office, which is unheard of. It's very rare. Doesn't happen as far as I can tell. There's a few people who are kind of part-time doing it, but to have two dedicated staff doing this is a big deal. And so my day-to-day is I go and I talk to the profs and I go to the departments and I do a lot of performance. I do a lot of going into these rooms and giving a slideshow, but a lot of it is the real thing behind it is that all the research around those profs who are going to be like, no, I'd rather not accommodate to the max. Like that's not, that doesn't feel right. It doesn't sit right for me and how education functions. A lot of the research shows that it's all you need to work on is the emotional side of that. Because what's happening is when they get 15 accommodation letters at the start of the semester, what do they feel? When they open up their inbox and there's 15 of these and they have to manage them up against 100 other students or 1,500 other students. And they're also on precarity and pressure, and all this stuff is happening in their world that this is coming in on top of. What's the emotional kind of hit of that when they first open it? Is it yay or is it ugh? And can we change the like ugh feeling just a little bit so that we give them the context and the and start to shift the emotion around that moment of opening that up. And that's just one incident. But when a student says, oh, I'm going to need extra time on an upcoming test, or I need an alternate assignment for this upcoming one because that one just doesn't work the way I work. They don't just go, ugh, I feel all the stuff, all the pressures that I have, and I don't see the value in giving this or providing what I need to provide for you. And so what I do on a day-to-day basis is try to shift what's called the emotional valence from a lot of frustration and anxiety and stress and maybe anger and all that stuff to, it doesn't have to be all the way to like happy sunshine and like roses. It doesn't have to be that far, but just shifting it enough that when they're confronted with that, they know what to do. They have a plan already. They can see a path that isn't the path they've always taken, and they start to feel confident in their ability to do these things like an alternative assignment or like managing 15 students with different accommodations. That's what I do on a day-to-day.
I mean, it sounds tough. It sounds, I mean, these are conversations that are so important, but they're really at the forefront of this big cultural shift in education. And I'm sure you're meeting all kinds of resistance. You mentioned a few numbers there, and they were just examples, but say 15 students asking for accommodation out of 100 perhaps in a class. And there's all kinds of types of accommodation. You gave a few examples there, extra time on a test, different kind of format for, or a more multimodal availability for different project expressions. Can you go into a little bit more detail? We know the numbers have changed. We know they've grown significantly. We hear all kinds of things. How many students, on average, in your experience, are asking or seeking accommodation now compared with perhaps in even the recent past? And can you just go into a little more detail on the types of accommodations that professors or instructors are being asked to provide?
Yeah. I mean, at our institution, I think it's something like 1 in 10, so a
Wow.
tenth of the population. I don't know if that would be true of everyone's, or if that's just unique to us. But even before the pandemic, the numbers were going up. So we do have the trending up. And so the number of students seeking accommodations, I think we start to see an upward trend, just even going back as far as 2016. It starts to get more and more students requiring accommodation. But then the reason for it. So it used to be learning disabilities were the number one reason for accommodation, and for by and large were the biggest bar on the bar chart. And then around that same time, it started to shift to invisible disabilities. So things like ADHD and mental health disabilities. So invisible disabilities are just disabilities that a professor, if they were looking, wouldn't be able to discern, right? They wouldn't be able to tell from any outward sign. And so that makes it a challenge too, because profs can't see the disability. So that makes it challenging. So, and they have no training in things like what an invisible disability is, what a mental health disability is, and why that would require more time on a test. And that is a lot of what I also do on a day-to-day basis, is letting them know that these are, unfortunately, when you don't have information, you make it up. Your bias fills it in. All kinds of things start flowing in, misconceptions start entering the chat, and it's not helpful at all. So I do a lot of work talking to them about, or taking the biases that I hear constantly, and I've stopped just having open Q&As. I start with like, here are the things that I hear the most. Let's talk about those first, and I'm going to take them away one at a time, let you know what's actually underneath that. So what's really going on with students who may have a mental health diagnosis, who can't perform a test in 30 minutes under pressure. And then there's this whole other layer to that you have to work with profs, which is, why do we have 30-minute high anxiety tests anyway? And what are you actually measuring? And why are we measuring it only that way? Are there other ways? And so it opens up this whole world of conversation that's really complex, but they have to be willing to hear it. And they are dealing with more students. So the truth of it is, it's absolutely 100% true. There are more students in their classes with disabilities who need accommodation. And they're going to have to figure a way through it. And it's not by pushing back. There's going to have to be some strategies in place for how they work with this new world of students who need that support. So UDL and things like that, so universal design for learning, are big talking points for us right now.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness for that, as they should be. I know, having worked with ADHD populations a little bit in my own career, the type of biases that I think you're referring to, and as you say, when you don't know, you fill in the gaps with maybe easy stories, or stories that make it so you don't have to change. And that can be invoking things like laziness, procrastination, what we might call malingering, or the claim that this student doesn't actually require this accommodation, that they come from a quote unquote soft generation, and that they, this is exactly the type of challenge that separates the wheat from the chaff, and isn't this what we're supposed to be doing in this, again, exclusionary system? And all of those ideas, as I found in my own personal experience, fall apart under scrutiny, right? Can you point us in the direction of what does success look like in these sessions, or maybe even long term, working with this faculty, helping them to overcome some of this motivated thinking and these biases that often prevent us from seeing the other clearly?
Yeah. There's lots so far. I mean, I've been in the role for 2 years, and in that time, the biggest thing I've launched along with my colleague is what's called the Policy 159 Faculty and Instructor Training. It's called the Shared Responsibility, and it basically takes them through the internal policy of the institution for a little bit. We give that some time, because you got to know that. But a lot of it is just about what it's like for a student to try to navigate this institution. You get to see behind the scenes of students who are navigating it. So we have like scenarios and stuff like that. And so you get to see both the faculty side and what they're dealing with, and then you also see the student, what the student is dealing with. So a student who got a traumatic brain injury and who has been avoiding going to get a diagnosis or get accommodation because he thinks he can do it without, and then suddenly his grades are going down, and now he really does need help, and he's finally getting it, and he gets this, and he gets into class and the prof says, no, I'm not giving you that accommodation. You're gaming the system,
Right.
whatever. Right. And having that experience, having the faculty experience it that way, the feedback from that has been, it's all interactive, and the feedback has been like, oh my gosh, I was that prof doing that thing, saying that thing, but now seeing it in this context and seeing the impact it has, I feel terrible and I'm not going to do that anymore. So we've had a lot of those. We actually had one prof dean who became like a champion of ours. His son has a learning disability,
Mm.
and he thought, is at university, and he thought, he just isn't trying hard enough. He was literally thinking that, and then he took our training and he became one of our biggest champions, and he wanted everybody to take the training and got all of his staff to take the training, and he said it changed how he sees his own son. Like, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. And again, it's all, even though we're giving them lots of information and it's a lot of the like, just here's the basics you do need to know, so much of it is grounded in emotional valence and shifting it from a negative emotional valence to a more positive emotional valence.
Mm. That seems to be at the heart of so much of what we're learning now about, especially motivation and things like self-belief and self-efficacy and how they play into your ability to address a challenge. Some of the stuff you mentioned, even for those who aren't dealing with, a traumatic brain injury or bereavement or the socioeconomic challenges that prevent so many from going to university, even just the paperwork can be enough to prevent some folks. And I know some who I was shocked by early in my university career, seeing who just went at it. Whatever it was, the application or the grant applying for a grant or going for a scholarship or some additional funding. They were excited to look, they were excited to research, and it just wasn't me. And I felt like I didn't even know where the starting point was for a lot of that stuff. And I wish I'd had someone talk to me about identifying the emotions that were associated with it, and maybe even identifying a few specific resources and parts of the university that might have helped me out. I know we got to get you out of here pretty shortly, but it strikes me that you've talked about a hidden curriculum in university, and you've talked about invisible disabilities going on with so many students. There's a lot that's unseen in universities. There's a lot that's going unacknowledged. For the educators and parents out there, and especially those who might be working with learners who are post-secondary, who are maybe in their high school or what have you, maybe they're adults thinking about going back and getting back into schooling. As you've said, there's something missing in the preparation for the settings that these students are walking into, these settings where they feel like they have to be silent and scared. As broadly or as specifically as you like, what sort of wisdom would you give to those parents and those educators to help their young people and their learners um, build some of the skills and resource bases and self-awareness that will help them navigate these really difficult post-secondary situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a tough one because I don't know what's already in place at that level, what they're already working toward. And I know so much of this is trial and error because I do it every day trying to figure out how do we solve this problem that's so big and
Mm-hmm.
we're individually all trying to solve it in our own ways. Which is that, like, how do you help somebody feel like they belong in a place that, as we have said, is already exclusionary? So how do you, maybe it's not helping them feel like they belong there, but helping them recognize that it is exclusionary. It has elements of it that are exclusionary, and normalizing that to an extent of, when you feel this, it's okay. So when you're on that very first day and you're trying to find your class and you're lost in the buildings and and it just feels like you're completely alone in all of this, or when you're in third year and you've gotten all A's and now you take an extra credit class and you get a C, like, how do you deal with those moments, because that has very little to do with you and very a lot to do with the things that aren't being taught to you, right? um so the way that I would hope, like with my own child when he's about to go to university, to approach it is like, you got to ask for help. Ask for help before you freak out. I mean, he's 3 and that's what I'm teaching him right now. Ask for help before you freak out. um because people have that information. The problem is it feels so uncomfortable to ask for it, right? Because everybody's talking as though it's just like obvious, to everyone. Everybody knows what a syllabus. Everybody knows how to write a literary analysis paper, and they know how that's different from a history paper, and they know how that's different from, making a podcast in your media class. Like, they can get the differences between these things, and you don't. So you stay quiet. And I think one of the best things we can teach them is to say, when you feel that feeling of discomfort, of not knowing, that a big part of being in university is asking for that blank to get filled in, because nobody's going to anticipate it and fill it in. People will, and those are the good ones. They're going to be great, but a lot of them aren't going to fill it in for you. Yeah.
So just getting past that silence. If it makes anyone out there feel better, one of the first classes I experienced in my grad work involved a professor asking us to use a QR code to go onto a presentation and then add our thoughts to this presentation. And I sat there, locked in on the QR code, clicking this link and having nothing pop up, not being able to get to the screen where I could add my thoughts for probably like 30 real life seconds. Along with every single other student in my class. These are people, again, early middle adulthood doing graduate work. We're the ones who are supposed to know pretty much what's going on and be able to navigate this stuff. And myself and these 20 other people in this situation sat silently until finally, I think maybe 45 seconds in, someone raised their hand and said to the prof, "This link isn't working for me." And immediately after that, 19 other people raised their hands and say, "Oh yeah, me neither," right? But none of us wanted to admit that. We thought it was our thing. And, this is deep-seated stuff. This is deep-seated cultural stuff. No one wanted to admit even that they couldn't access that link, much less that they didn't know something perhaps more important.
But there's another layer to that we forget, that I didn't even talk about today, which was that there's power at play. There's a hierarchy in the classroom, and there's a professor there who gets reverence, and like, that's old. That's part of a long standing history of an almost archetype of that person at the front of the room, right? That doesn't get questioned. And unfortunately, that gets reinforced in some ways along the way. But maybe the best thing we can do is say that it's okay to question that person, to diffuse some of the power structure that's there.
Yeah. Well, we want to raise ideas and voices like yours as much as possible and make them as loud as possible. And I'm so thankful for you taking the time to join us today. So thankful for the work that you're doing at TMU and the disabilities office there. And I hope other schools and other people are taking on this mantle and doing this work for young people, because I think it's beyond clear at this point for anybody who's come through school systems like ours. It's much needed. It's long overdue. Before I get you out of here, are there other voices or ideas like these that we might be amplifying for folks who are interested in getting on this train and moving towards this kind of inclusivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of people doing this work. I think the people at Niagara College have already done a great deal of work. If you look up what they have available just online for anybody to see, there are movements happening. The University of Guelph is working on this really great resource that will be available to everyone about accessibility and things to support faculty in learning that. I think people are doing it. People recognize it. And I think this moment is a good moment. We're really kind of tied up in certain issues like Chat GPT and stuff like that. So I think what needs to happen is that things like universal design for learning are not forgotten in that moment. So if people are doing that, for one, I would love to hear from them and talk to them about how they're dealing with it. And also, I don't like that we're all isolated at our individual institutions trying to solve these massive problems.
Mm-hmm.
So I think rather than say there are people doing this, I would love to say, whoever's doing it, I would love to talk to you and to start to work together on these big issues. Yeah.
Where can people reach out to you for a conversation like that?
My TMU email is my last name, which has 3 I's in it. You can see it probably in the show notes.
Yes.
At torontomu.ca.
That's really generous of you. Thank you. As always, folks, we'll have everything that Jenny just mentioned, along with a good deal more from our past hour of conversation in the show notes. If you're interested in things like universal design for learning, the hidden curriculum, the stuff going on at TMU, Niagara College, UGuelph, and hopefully many other places, that's all going to be available for you in hopes of keeping conversations like this going and keeping them loud. Jenny, thanks for helping us do just that in our own small way today. Any final words for anyone listening before you get out of here?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much. This was very fun, and my brain feels like it just got a really good massage. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that's one of the cooler compliments we've gotten on the show. Thanks so much, Jenny. All right. Well, looking
Thanks.
forward to many, many more chats like this with great people like Jenny Sampirisi in the future. Till then, I've been your host, Mike Helsby, with the Braemar Life Skills Academy podcast. Thank you so much for listening.